She cast her vote against the motion at 300 station time, when the chamber was mostly empty and the result was already decided. The Concord expulsion directive had passed by 41 votes to 9. Earth was to be removed from all treaty frameworks, stripped of waypoint access, and reclassified as a non-aligned species pending behavioral review. The motion had been building for 2 years, constructed carefully by the Velhari bloc and 3 of the mid-tier council members, who had grown tired of humanity's insistence on arguing about things that had already been decided and asking questions about things that were not their business, and generally behaving as if the Concord was a conversation rather than a structure they had been permitted to join. Councilor Emis Sova of the Dethani delegation was the 9th vote against. She did not make a speech. She did not call for a recount. She entered her vote into the record, gathered her briefing materials from the desk with both hands the way you gathered something you intended to keep, and walked out of the chamber into the corridor where her aide was waiting. Her aide's name was Orvin. He had worked for her for 6 years. He read her face the way you read a face you have spent 6 years learning to read, and he did not ask how the vote had gone. He said instead quietly, "The transport is ready." She told him, "Good, let's go home." She was 53 years old the night she cast that vote. She had been on the Concord Council for 11 years, representing the Dethani Home Cluster, a system of 4 inhabited worlds in the Mid-Belt that had joined the Concord 40 years ago under her predecessor's administration. The Dethani were not a large species. They were not a powerful one, in the sense that power was measured in the Concord, which was mostly in fleet capacity and resource volume, and the number of planets that would answer a communication from you promptly. They had 12 seats on the council. They had 3 trade agreements and 1 mutual defense pact, and a long-standing reputation for reading documents carefully before signing them, which the larger blocks found inconvenient and the smaller ones found reassuring. Emis Sova had built her 11 years on the council around 2 things: a refusal to vote for anything she had not personally read in full, and a refusal to vote against anything that she could not explain to a Dethani outer settlement worker in plain language that the worker would recognize as honest. This was not a popular combination. It had cost her allies, and it had cost her committee seats, and it had earned her a reputation among certain blocks as someone who was not a team player, which in Concord political language meant someone who was not their team's player, which was different. The expulsion directive had been 412 pages. She had read all of it. She had also read the 14-page counter-submission filed by the human delegation 3 weeks before the vote, which most of the council had received, acknowledged, and not read. She had read it twice. The human document was not what she had expected. It was not defensive. It was not a list of grievances. It was a careful, methodical argument with footnotes, and the footnotes had footnotes of their own, and several of those footnotes led to publicly available Concord records that she had not known existed, and that, when she pulled them, said something different from what the vote's supporters had been saying in committee. Not a dramatic difference. Not a smoking document. Just a steady, quiet, accumulated pattern of discrepancy between what was claimed and what the record showed. She had flagged it in her briefing notes. She had raised it in committee. The committee chair had thanked her for her thoroughness and moved to the next item. She voted against the directive, 9 votes to 41. Earth was removed from the Concord. She did not know, when she walked out of that chamber at 300, that she had 31 years left to live. She did not know that in the 31st year, her world would need help. She did not know that the record of her vote would still exist. The Dethani Home Cluster was not hit by a single event. It was hit by a sequence of them, in the way that catastrophes that feel sudden always turn out, on examination, to have been patient. The first event was a stellar flare that disrupted the power grid infrastructure on Deth Kavar, the cluster's most populous world. The second event was the supply chain contraction that followed, because Death Cavar was the manufacturing center for the cluster, and when its grid went down, it took the production capacity of 4 key distribution systems with it. The third event was the drought on Dethani that had been building for 6 years, and that the cluster's agricultural board had been managing carefully and successfully, until the supply chain contraction removed 3 of the 4 tools they had been using to manage. The cascade was not anyone's fault in the way that made accountability simple. It was the fault of interconnected systems that had worked well separately and failed together. The Dethani called it the thread pull, the moment when you pull one thread and find out how much of the fabric was holding by that single thread alone. Emis Sova was 84 years old when the thread pull began. She had retired from the council 12 years earlier. She was living on Death Cavar in the residential district near the Agricultural Planning Center, because retirement for someone who had read documents carefully for 11 years on the Concord Council turned out to look a lot like reading documents carefully for an organization that was trying to prevent agricultural disasters before they became agricultural emergencies. She was reading documents when the grid went down. The lights in her study went with them. She sat for a moment in the dark, in the quiet that follows the cessation of ambient sound you had stopped noticing, and then she found her hand terminal by memory and turned on the light and kept reading. She was 84 years old, and she had been the 9th vote against the expulsion directive 31 years ago, and she had not thought about that vote in quite some time. Not because she regretted it, but because 31 years had put a great deal of other material between herself and the memory. She thought about it now, not because of the grid, because 2 days after the grid went down, her aide, a different aide, Orvin had retired 8 years ago, brought her a communication from the Concord diplomatic relay that she had not expected. The communication was from the human delegation. It had taken the human representative 3 days to find the Dethani contact channel, because the Dethani were not in the Concord anymore. They had left 41 votes to 9, and the bureaucratic infrastructure of departure had been thorough. There were no official channels between Earth and the Dethani cluster, because official channels required the kind of formal relationship that the expulsion directive had specifically terminated. The human representative had found the channel anyway. Her name was Warrant Officer Jessa Lind. She was 29 years old, and she was stationed at the nearest outer relay to the Dethani cluster, a waypoint called Ferris Station that handled traffic in 4 directions, and had a particularly good set of long-range sensors, and a particularly resourceful signals officer named T, who had been working with Jessa Lind for 2 years and who, when Lind said, "I need to reach the Dethani cluster, and there is no formal channel," had thought for about 40 seconds and said, "There is one more thing I can try." The channel T found was not official. It was a remnant of the Mutual Defense Pact infrastructure, a communication relay that had been formally decommissioned but had not, due to an administrative oversight in the departure proceedings, been physically disconnected. It existed in a technical limbo, not authorized, not terminated, not active, not closed. T powered it up, and it worked perfectly. Lynn's message came through on a Tuesday morning, which on Death Cavar was indistinguishable from any other morning, except that the grid was still down in the outer districts, and the Agricultural Board had just issued their first formal shortage assessment. The message was brief. It did not begin with formal credentials or diplomatic preamble. It began, "I know this channel is not supposed to be active. I know there is no official relationship. I know you have no reason to respond. I am reaching out anyway because we have been watching the cascade reports and I want to know what you need. Then, we are aware that this is outside our current authorization. I have filed the contact report with my division director. I have also filed a request for emergency liaison status, which will take 6 weeks to process. I am not waiting 6 weeks to ask the question." Then, my division director knows I sent this. She told me to tell you that she is aware it is irregular, and she does not intend to stop me. Then the last line, We have not forgotten the vote. Emis Sova read the message in her study with the hand terminal and the quiet and the dark beyond the window where the grid was still down. She read it 3 times. She had not known the vote was remembered. She had voted the way she voted because the record showed what it showed, and the human document said what it said, and she could not have explained to an outer settlement worker why she had voted otherwise. She had not voted expecting anything to return from it. That was not why she had read all 412 pages. It was not why she had read the human counter-submission twice. She had read them because she read things. That was the job. She set the terminal down on the desk carefully. She picked it up again. She began to write. The response she see. NT was not formal either. It opened. You asked what we need. Here is what we need. She attached 3 documents: the Agricultural Board's shortage assessment, the grid infrastructure failure report, and a logistics analysis that the cluster's planning center had prepared 3 days before the grid went down, which turned out to have been a document that predicted almost exactly what happened and had been filed in the review queue by a committee that had run out of meeting time. Then, I am including a document that we prepared before this started and did not act on in time. I am including it because you should know we understood the risk, and I do not intend to begin this conversation with anything other than complete information. Then I was the 9th vote. I did not know you were counting. The last line. Tell me what your authorization allows, and I will tell you what our critical path looks like, and we can work from there. Jessa Lind received the message 6 hours later. She read it once at her desk. Then she walked to T's station and set the terminal down in front of him and said nothing. He read it. He looked up at her. She said, "How long does the relay hold?" He told her, "Indefinitely. Nothing's degrading, it's a clean connection." She picked up the terminal and walked back to her desk and started writing her response and simultaneously filed an amended contact report with her division director, flagged as urgent, with a note that said, she replied, 3 documents attached. One is a pre-event risk assessment they didn't act on. She disclosed it voluntarily. I think we should treat this as a functioning contact, not a one-time relay test. Her division director responded in 40 minutes. The response was 4 words: agree, keep me informed. What followed was not a formal aid operation. It was not permitted to be a formal aid operation because there was no formal relationship, and the authorization request was in a 6-week queue, and the 6-week queue was not going to move faster simply because a Dethani world was in the 2nd week of a cascade failure. That was not how queues worked. What it was, instead, was a series of things that were individually within authorization and collectively substantial. Jessa Lind's division had a logistics consultation function that was authorized for use with non-Concord member species and civilizations. She activated it for the Dethani cluster. The Outer Relays Medical Supply Depot had a standing provision for emergency distribution to distressed populations within its operational range. The Dethani cluster was within operational range. Lind filed the distribution request. It was approved in 4 hours. A human agricultural engineering firm operating under a private Concord commercial license had been working on the drought mitigation problem in the Exiling region for 2 years. Independently, because the firm's director had read a Concord environmental monitoring report, had noticed the 6-year drought trend, and had submitted a commercial proposal to the Dethani Agricultural Board that had been declined due to budget constraints. The firm's director's name was Cadden Morris. When Lind contacted him and told him the situation had changed, he told her, "We kept the proposal files. We can redeploy in 3 weeks if someone will approve the access permit." She filed the access permit. It was technically a cross-authorization with a non-member species that required a specialist sign-off. She found the specialist, called them directly, explained the timeline, and waited on the line while they read the file. The specialist signed it in 11 minutes. Each of those things was within someone's authorization. None of them required the expulsion directive to be reversed or the formal relationship to be restored. They required people who were within range of a problem and within reach of a tool that could address it to look at both of those facts simultaneously and understand that the distance between them was a decision. Emis Sova watched it happen from her study on Death Cavar, grid restored by day 9, reading the update communications that Lind sent every 48 hours through the unofficial relay that was still, technically, not supposed to be active. She read every one of them, all the way through, including the appendices. On the 31st day, she sent a communication back that was not a status request or a logistics question. It was personal. It opened. You told me you had not forgotten the vote. I want to tell you something that I did not know how to put in the first message because the first message needed to be practical and this is not practical. I voted the way I voted because I read your submission and the record showed what it showed. I did not know what I was starting. I did not know there was anything to start. I thought I was simply the 9th vote against a motion that passed 41-9, and that was all it was. Then I am 84 years old. I have been reading documents carefully for 60 years because that was the job. I have voted against things that passed. I have voted for things that failed. I have mostly believed that the individual vote in a chamber of 50 is a small thing in the arithmetic of large decisions. Then I want to tell you that I think I was wrong about that, not about the vote, about the arithmetic. The last line, thank you, for my world, for reading the assessment I sent you and not using it against us, for not waiting for the cue. Jessa Lind received that message on a Tuesday morning, between a logistics update and a supply confirmation, and she read it at her desk with her hands flat on the surface the way you put your hands down when you need the desk to be solid beneath you. She wrote back. It took her several attempts. She wrote formal versions and deleted them because they had the wrong shape. She wrote brief ones and deleted them because they did not say the thing that needed to be in the center. She finally wrote what was true and cut everything around it. You read 412 pages when you did not have to. You read the counter submission twice. You walked out of a chamber where you were the 9th vote out of 50, and you did not make a speech, and you gathered your materials, and you went home and you kept working. I know this because we have the voting record and we kept it the way you keep something you intend not to forget. The humans who stayed in that chamber after you left the 9, they kept the record. They gave it to the next delegation. The next delegation gave it to us. Then I did not wait for the queue because you did not wait for the chamber to be full before you voted. I did not need the relay to be authorized because you did not need the room to be on your side. Some things just need to be the right thing at the right time, and the rest of the conditions are details. Then the last line, we also kept the counter submission, with both your notes in the margin. I have read them. The full authorization came through in 7 weeks. By then, the medical supply distribution had reached the outer settlements. The agricultural engineering team was 3 weeks into the drought mitigation deployment on Dethani. The grid on Death Cavar was fully restored, and the planning center had begun the infrastructure redundancy review that the original logistics analysis had recommended, and that was finally going to receive a full committee meeting rather than a review queue. The formal diplomatic restoration of the human-Dethani relationship took 2 more years. It required a specific council motion, a bilateral commission, and a very long series of documents that were all read carefully by at least one person on both sides before anyone signed anything. During those 2 years, the unofficial relay remained active. No one closed it. No one had, technically, been asked to, and the administrative oversight that had left it running had not been corrected because correcting it had not been added to anyone's queue. When the formal relationship was restored, the first official act of the new bilateral commission was to authorize the relay retroactively, which made it official, which changed nothing about how it had been used, but gave it a proper record. The relay record, once formalized, included the full communications log from the 31 days of unofficial contact, every message, every document, every appendix. The line that appears most frequently in the historical accounts is the one Jessa Lind wrote on a Tuesday morning about things that need to be the right thing at the right time, and the rest of the conditions are details. The line that appears second most frequently is the last line of Emis Sova's final message, sent the morning after the full authorization came through, 3 days before she received the update that the drought mitigation deployment had exceeded its first phase targets. It was one sentence. I thought I was the 9th vote. Emis Sova died at 89 years old, in the study on Death Kavar, with her hand terminal on the desk, and a document open on the screen that she had been reading when she stopped. The document was a Concord Agricultural Environmental Report, 18 months current, flagged with a note in her own handwriting in the margin. Bring this to the commission. She had not brought it yet. She had been in the middle of reading it. Orvin, her first aide, who had come out of retirement when he heard about the thread pull and had not in 4 years gone back again, found her that morning and read the document and the note, and understood that the job was not done and that she had known that and had been doing it anyway, up until the moment she wasn't. He sent a copy of the document to Jessa Lind. The cover note was 3 lines. She was reading this when she died. She would have wanted someone to keep reading it. I am sending it to you because I think you are the kind of person who finishes what someone else starts. Lind received it on a Tuesday morning. She read it all the way through, including the footnotes. The footnotes led her somewhere that changed the shape of what she thought she understood, not dramatically, not all at once, in the way that things you find in footnotes always change shapes quietly and completely, and only for someone who was paying attention. She flagged it, she passed it to the commission read it. The cascade it prevented does not have a name because it never happened. That is what the humans remember. Not the relay, not the authorization, not the 31 days of logistics communications through an unofficial channel that was technically not supposed to be active. They remember that a Dethani council member read 412 pages on a directive that was going to pass anyway, and found the counter-submission, and read it twice, and voted the way the document told her to vote, and walked out of the chamber at 300 without making a speech. They remember that she sent the risk assessment she hadn't acted on in time, because she did not intend to begin the conversation with anything other than complete information. They remember that she thought she was the 9th vote. She was the 9th vote. She was also, it turns out, the first link in a chain that ran 31 years in one direction and kept running after she was gone, through a Tuesday morning and a flagged footnote, and a commission that read what someone handed them and understood that the rest of the conditions were details. The Dethani have a phrase for this. It translates roughly as the vote that counted after the counting stopped. It is not a metaphor about elections. It is an acknowledgement that some decisions go on mattering after the moment that made them, in directions the person who made them could not have predicted, and that the weight of a vote is not always visible in the chamber where it was cast. The humans added their own phrase when the Bilateral Commission formalized the relay log into the historical record. It is the phrase they use when they talk about the kind of work that looks small from the outside and is not. They call it reading the full document. It does not sound like much. It turns out to be most of it. She was 53 years old the night she cast that vote. She was the 9th voice in a room of 50, at 300, when the result was already decided and the chamber was mostly empty, and there was no one in the corridor to see her gather her materials with both hands and walk out. She did not know what she had started. She thought she was simply voting. reading carefully and voting honestly, and going home and doing the job the next morning the same way she had done it the morning before. She was right. That was the whole of it. That was enough. If this one stayed with you, share it with someone who still believes a single vote doesn't matter. If you want to hear what the humans did next, subscribe. I'll see you in the next one. Stay human.